Good morning, everybody. We are right at 9 o'clock, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to our monthly Mornings with O'Keeffe program. My name is Molly Baker, and I'm the Adult Programs Manager at the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum. I would first like to start by recognizing the lands of the Pueblo people on which the sites of the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum stand. We recognize and honor their elders, past and present, and celebrate the vitality of their people today and into future generations. I offer this with humility and gratitude in acknowledgement of the need to confront the ongoing injustices of colonial settlerism. I would also like to extend a thank you to our members and donors who are here today. Your support made this event possible. And if you're not a member and enjoy this program, please consider joining today. Visit gokm.org/membership to learn more. Throughout this talk, please place your questions in the Q&A box, which can be found at the bottom or top of your screen, depending on your device. We'll try to answer as many as possible at the end of the conversation. For the duration of this lecture, the chat has been disabled, but please do note that following today's talk, a recording will be made available on the O'Keeffe Museum website in about a week's time. Captions in both English and Spanish will be available. It's now my pleasure to introduce our speakers today. We're joined by three wonderful guests. First, I'd like to introduce Linda Churchill, the Horticulture Director at the Santa Fe Botanical Garden. Beth Murphy, Luce Curator of Art and Social Practice at the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum. And Yaritza Martina Poole, Curatorial Assistant at the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum. If you'd like to learn more about our guests, visit our website and you can read their bios in full. Thank you so much for being here. And with that, I will turn it over to our presenters.
Thank you so much for that, Molly. I am going to share my screen and begin sharing the PowerPoint with everyone. So Bess, maybe you and I can start talking about how we came with what sort of the premise and the thesis for Rooted in Place is, and sort of the brief introduction about it, and how we came to partner with the Santa Fe Botanical Garden, and the reason for Linda's presence today.
Absolutely. So welcome to Rooted in Place. We're going to be discussing this wonderful exhibition that's actually going to be opening in Santa Fe at the O'Keeffe Museum next week. So hopefully anybody who is in the area or passing through can stop by and see the exhibition in person. And so, yeah, the origin of this exhibition was sort of an interesting journey into O'Keeffe's body of work. I think O'Keeffe is often recognized for her depictions of flowers, some of her abstractions, some of her New Mexico landscapes, particularly when you're here in New Mexico. But in spending more time with the body of work, Yadi and I and the rest of our team sort of happened upon this idea of trees being really incredibly central to O'Keeffe's practice. So do you want to say a little bit more about that, Yadi?
I do. Absolutely. Just to refortify the last sentence that you said, how central trees were to O'Keeffe's body of work, and probably lesser known to a general public when compared to her flower paintings. And what was really interesting about trees, and really what the exhibition tries to sort of expand on in the small space where we've curated a variety of paintings and drawings of trees, is how trees really embody a sense of place for O'Keeffe, and a sense of identity, and even sort of an introspection and a deep analysis of nature, one that involves trees. And trees sort of provide this perspective of how O'Keeffe viewed nature, how O'Keeffe analyzed aspects of nature, but also how O'Keeffe depicted the places where she traveled to. So one really crucial thing about this exhibition is that when O'Keeffe travels to a place or sets roots in a place, she tends to depict or paint trees, and that becomes sort of an embodiment of or symbolic of the place that she's sort of rooted herself in, hence the title of the exhibition.
Exactly. I really love this idea that trees were the lens through which O'Keeffe was processing place. No matter where she went, we have these pieces, whether it was sketches, photography, watercolors, or full oil on canvas paintings. Everywhere she went, she was really working through place, through these key ecological examples, right? Through these trees. They were such profound forms for her, I think, both visually and emotionally.
Absolutely. And I think now that we've sort of introduced the exhibition and the ideas behind it, well, maybe we can feature some of, not all of the artwork, but some of the artwork that was crucial for this research and that we felt really captured this sense of place and identity for O'Keeffe and observations of nature. And maybe Beth, you and I and Linda, you can contribute to sort of the ecological perspective of these trees that we have here on the slide. But really, I thought maybe Bess, you and I could talk about Lake George, which is this old tree from 1918, this watercolor to the proper left, and then the palm tree at my door, which is a much later work that O'Keeffe paints later in her life, and how these really capture O'Keeffe's understanding of place through trees. So maybe we can talk a little bit about the old tree from Lake George, so early, and this is really Lake George and this trip at Lake George, which, by the way, 1918 is the second trip she takes to Lake George after she marries or after she becomes joins a romantic relationship with Alfred Stieglitz. And this is the second trip that she takes with him. She did take one in 1908 as a young student with classmates. But this becomes a trip in Lake George, at Lake George.
Well, and I think it's important on this that so O'Keeffe would continue traveling to Lake George, New York, with Stieglitz. This was where his family had their summer home. And so for many years, summers would be spent at Lake George with Alfred Stieglitz and his pretty large family. And so I think there's a lot of emotion that happens in the images that she creates during all of these trips to this location. It was definitely, so she was going from the extreme of being in Manhattan to this much more rural location, although it was a popular tourist destination at the time, but still it was like going to a farmhouse, essentially a large, lovely farmhouse, but a farmhouse nonetheless. So, and you can see how I love this piece because her early watercolors are so active, so full of feeling and movement. You almost feel like in this piece, the limbs of the old gnarled maple tree are in motion across the sheet of paper.
Absolutely. And one really interesting thing about this tree is that the old tree is actually a rendering or a presentation of a maple tree. And she did make about 3 different maple tree works from this trip in 1918. And really, this abstract watercolor evokes a sense of place, but also how she begins to observe nature at Lake George, and Lake George becomes very essential for that. At Lake George, she begins to look closely at a variety of flora, and the old tree becomes a way for her to begin observing nature in the unique way in which she usually did. O'Keeffe was not the only one to have this old tree, which I believe the term was coined by Alfred Stieglitz. It was also central in Stieglitz' photography. So there was a deep history with this maple tree for O'Keeffe and the Stieglitz estate that she was staying at and his family. And although she has another painting, which is oil on canvas of this particular tree, this one is completely abstracted, whereas the other one isn't totally. It shows how she begins experimenting with it, and she chooses colors really which sort of range in terms of the color palette and perhaps aren't natural to certain trees. And so it shows her experimentation with color as well.
I'd like to jump in here too and note that trees, and I think she caught this very well, trees have so much to say about not only the environment we're in, but how we are in the environment. Trees and sometimes the absence of trees. So for example, in northern New York, upstate New York, you might see a lot of trees, lots of green through the year, lots of color in the fall, and the relationship with the land is somewhat flavored by that density of trees, even though she clearly captured the spirit of an individual tree, as compared to here in New Mexico, where a lot of our land you see brown because it's dirt and not dense trees wall to wall. And so each tree here becomes its own character and very important within the landscape. I know I grew up in a place with lots of trees, and when I moved here, I felt like it changed my character a little bit because of how my relationship with those trees changed.
Oh, that's such a great point. I feel like, thanks, Linda. I feel like I had the opposite because I'm from here, and then I moved to the East Coast for a while, and I was like overwhelmed by the density, right? It is interesting how, yeah.
Absolutely.
I wonder, oh, sorry, Hattie. I was just going to say, as we sort of transition from the movement of the old tree to the movement that we see in the palm tree at my door, Yadi, maybe we'll have you talk a little bit about that, but I want to throw a curveball at Linda that we didn't discuss just a little bit, because I had forgotten when we were talking about this presentation, one of my favorite moments in like the preparation and the dialogue with the botanical gardens was this moment where all of us at the O'Keeffe sort of embarrassingly were informed that palm trees are not in fact trees.
Right.
They're actually grasses, very large grasses, you might say. So their whole structure of what we call the trunk of the tree moves fluids and nutrients up and down differently from the way trees specifically do. And the inside of a palm tree is more than a tree is. A tree is wood, it's hard, it's not necessarily live anymore, although it's important part of the structure of the tree. Palm trees are very different that way. So
absolutely. And I did want to mention that because I think it's a very fun fact, and we all like educated ourselves on the fact that palm trees are not trees, even though they have the word tree in them. But we still wanted to include it because it might not be widely recognized or known. But yes, moving on to the palm tree at my door, Antigua. And it happens much later, but I think it has a really interesting interrelationship with the old tree from 1918. And that, again, she travels to a place and then captures a tree specifically rather than anything else that was within her vicinity. And so this palm tree at my door charcoal on paper is made during a trip in the mid-70s with her assistant Juan Hamilton. At the time, O'Keeffe had already been diagnosed with macular degeneration, which basically means that she lost her central vision and was relying on peripheral vision. And that's really how this charcoal comes to be through her use of peripheral vision. But what's really interesting about this charcoal in particular is that O'Keeffe is in Antigua and decides to sketch palm trees with a felt tip pen, and then returns to New Mexico. And it's in New Mexico that she then renders them onto charcoal and paper. And this is one of them. And really, I think some of the key things that this drawing shows or reveals is that O'Keeffe, one, is making artwork using peripheral vision. Two, she's able to retain the memory of the palm tree as she returns to New Mexico, even with the felt tip drawing, which is particularly interesting. And then the third thing, which is even though she is at the close of her career and having difficulty creating artwork, and had stopped actually for a while and had moved over to more tactile art, which was ceramics with Hamilton, who had expertise with ceramics. It's when she travels to Antigua and a couple of other places that she begins to draw again, and her drawings become a little larger, and sort of the technique changes a little bit, which makes sense for maybe the shakiness of a hand. What's interesting, and maybe best you can talk a little bit about it, is this swoop in the center that runs throughout the middle of the palm tree and really helps guide O'Keeffe. And we had talked about it with our conservator Dale, and really guides O'Keeffe to create the fronds of the palm tree, and it allows O'Keeffe to sort of give it shape.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think when you look at both of these pieces, in fact, but especially the charcoal, where you can see her finger markings in the charcoal as she was smudging it, and it's so physical, it's so tactile, which, like Yadi was talking about, really makes perfect sense for her time in her life, for the loss of her vision, that she is really working with her hands in a very physical way in these pieces. But I think it's interesting how you can see in both of these images, there's this key sort of central arcing line that almost divides the entire plane in diagonally, right? So just completely in half at the diagonal. And it's so interesting what that does for your eye when you're looking at a piece like this. It just creates this movement across the whole field of vision for you, whether the scale is tiny or large. It makes you travel along with her hand in a way across the paper, across the canvas. And I think it's really interesting. You'll see some of the paintings later on that are in the exhibition where she also does this similar action where she's filling up the entire surface that she's working on, to the extent that there's branches here, like you can see the palm fronds that continue outside of the piece of paper. And so in a way, she's manipulating our sense of scale and how we can process the information that we're seeing. And in the palm tree at my door, you can really see that thick pencil or charcoal, sorry, it's early in the morning still, but that charcoal line that Yadi was talking about there that has the most force on it. And so you can see how much pressure she was applying to that piece of charcoal as she was moving. And that was probably a first mark, but then also returned to as final mark, which is really interesting.
Absolutely. And I think another key thing to mention is that obviously she's struggling with her vision, and she returns to these foundational mediums, charcoal and watercolor, as we can see from her earlier career, was also a sort of foundational medium. And so working with charcoal, this dry art medium, allows O'Keeffe to sort of utilize these foundational techniques that might be ingrained in her through muscle memory, which are often necessitated when you are undergoing or having difficulty with vision loss. So that becomes really key. And I think another key thing to mention too, as we move forward to the next slide, and as Linda talks about the key species of New Mexico and the ecology of New Mexico and the trees that grow in New Mexico's ecosystems, is that Lake George, the lines between Lake George and New Mexico, as we will see, are blurred in terms of the aesthetic overlap. There's a lot of aesthetic overlap in that she's painting trees in Lake George and then does that again in New Mexico.
So yeah, let's move forward. I think, yeah, and hear a little bit more from Linda. The partnership with the Botanical Garden has been so powerful for us. And so we're incredibly grateful for all of their insight. If you come into the exhibition, you'll see that there are labels that the O'Keeffe Museum created, but then there are labels and interpretation from the Botanical Garden. There's conversation with the Botanical Garden in our audio tour, and you can also find all of that online. So Linda, tell us a little bit more.
Okay. It's interesting, the relationship between the O'Keeffe Museum and the Botanical Gardens. We both started sort of late in life for Santa Fe, which is over 400 years old, as fairly recent public spaces, institutions or gathering places. And we have a really strong connection that way. And also we've both been fairly successful in what we do in the last few decades. So it's really exciting to see both of us grow. I wanted to give you a little bit of visual takeaway from the Botanical Garden. The organization started in 1987, and from the beginning, we had the sense and the view that we really wanted to show people what it's like to be in Santa Fe in northern New Mexico. So we don't have big beds of annuals that get traded out 3 times a year. Instead, we very much emphasize the native plants and naturalized plants that are adapted to this really low water place. And of course, even though these slides don't show so much the tree background, there's a little bit there. They're very important, as I said before, to the entire character of the land and certainly of our garden. So one interesting thing that's a relationship with O'Keeffe's work as well is that she noticed detail quite a lot. And light was very important to her work. And you can see that these are shots taken in the fall, and you can see the intense detail, which you really notice in New Mexico because there's more space between plants and between other things in the landscape. And in the fall, especially with the grass seed heads, you really see movement, which we were just talking about in the previous slide, and the beautiful light that plays in New Mexico, especially in autumn, but it's really true all year round. So as well as ornamental gardens, we have a lot of pollinator gardens and various gathering spaces in our garden, which is only 10 years old, P.S. The garden has a fruit orchard, which sort of is another relationship with Georgia O'Keeffe because she planted and tended fruit at her own orchard in Abiquiu. We also have a section of vegetable garden terraces that help teach people about edible gardening here in this place where it can be a little hard to grow things. We have a focus at section that focuses on ethnobotanical plants, and also a third section which we just opened a couple years ago, which is our Pinon Juniper Woodland, which is a very lightly managed area of the garden where people can really get a sense of what our native woodlands look like and feel like around northern New Mexico. And I think there's a strong relationship between our woodland and the area where Georgia O'Keeffe lived in Abiquiu and also in Ghost Ranch. Exactly what mix of trees there are depends very much on where the water is and what the elevation is here. So it's important to our garden, and I think it was very important to her gardening and her painting as well.
Thank you for that, Linda. We will move over to a bit of the artwork that we can talk about in relationship to trees and O'Keeffe. And the first piece that I want to talk about is this early sketch that I found in one of O'Keeffe's sketchbooks when she would have been about 17 or so. And what was really interesting about this is that she would have been a student at the School for the Art Institute of Chicago, and at the time, and she would have been a student of John Vanderpool, who was teaching anatomical drawing in Chicago at the time. So it makes sense for the human figure to the left of the sketch, and then that line, that wobbly line that sort of divides the sketch in half, then has a tree to the right of it. And it's particularly interesting in that we see O'Keeffe studying the human body and human anatomy, but then also has sort of the sketch of tree anatomy to the proper right. And then to the further right of it, this graphite on paper of a banyan tree from 1934, which would have been one of two trips to Bermuda that she took while she was recovering from severe depression, and had stopped creating work for a period of time, and then sort of restored her creative energy by drawing trees and a couple of banana flowers in Bermuda. And it's interesting to juxtapose this drawing from the sketchbook of 1905 and then this drawing from 1934, almost 2 decades later, and how O'Keeffe is really studying anatomy, but not only human anatomy, but also tree anatomy, and what that says about her presentation of trees. And maybe, Linda, you can talk a little bit about the anthropomorphism of trees in art history and in art. And if you know any facts about banyans and how their real roots are sort of really interesting and make them really unique trees.
Banyan trees get to be very large trees over time, partly because they put air roots down, which then root into the ground, and so the trees keep getting wider and wider. This is maybe a younger tree because you don't see it so much in this one, but they get to be quite large and they have quite a lot of character one to the other. It's actually the national tree of India, which is where it's native to. People really revere the banyan tree there, and it represents sort of meditation and spiritual growth and self-awareness. There's an anecdotal story, maybe not so anecdotal, about Buddha having sat under the banyan tree when he came to enlightenment. They don't grow here in New Mexico. They need warmer temperatures than what we have, and they can't handle freezing, but they do grow in far south in the United States. It's really interesting because this tree, both this sketch and the tree in general, really have this strong spiritual connotation. Besides feeling like a human figure, as the sketch does, there's, this sense of place that the tree has, and the sense of it feeling like maybe the trunk of a body. It's even twisting there at the bottom where you could see maybe a thigh coming out. You can almost see a belly button on that tree. And then the arms and neck and head come rising up out of the tree in this sort of beautiful, calm presence. And that's kind of how banyan trees feel. And an interesting aside as well, which brings us back to Ms. O'Keeffe, is that the banyan tree is in the genus Ficus, which is also the same genus where edible figs come from, or the nomenclature is the same. And she had an edible fig tree in her garden, which she tended and which is still alive in the garden, which is an amazement to anybody that's seen the garden and seen that tree. It's quite a healthy tree. So
it is really incredible that it's still alive. I mean, it's really hard to grow fig trees here in our climate, and that has not just survived, but it's thrived. I think I just had a fig from that tree this summer, and it was delicious, and it was like a bountiful crop. It was amazing.
Yeah, they're pretty incredible trees.
Should we keep on going?
Yes.
Excellent.
1 second.
Wonderful.
Bess, maybe you and I can talk a little bit about but perhaps less widely known, that O'Keeffe did photograph and did dabble in the art of photography, particularly sort of in the mid 1900s, as and she was she was friends with a couple of photographers, and then had a brief education from Todd Webb on photography, and gave her first in the 1950s, and she begins photographing, and how these photographs that we have here of the big sage are symbolic of the way that she is observing nature, and how photography provides sort of a vision into O'Keeffe's artistic thought process and the way she observed nature.
I think these are really interesting because they show how much she was constantly experimenting with form and perspective and framing. And so, I mean, when you think about photography, a lot of the ideas around photography really relate to this notion of framing. And anybody who takes photos, even with your camera, right? You can think about how you can totally change how an image works, what it does by how you literally use the frame of the camera of the image to zoom in or zoom out or shift angles. And you can see that she was looking at this really amazing very structural, twisty, turny plant, but she took a whole series of photographs. So this is just 2 out of the whole series where she was sort of circling around these sage plants, going closer in, moving further out. And when you look at her other artworks, you can see how she's doing that in all of the different media that she's using. So in a way, these are artworks on their own, in their own right. And in a way, they're also sort of studies for how she approaches form in all of her other work. And so I think these are really lovely images. I also just think that it's wonderful for folks to know how varied her practice was, that this was part of it. And while she was married to Alfred Stieglitz, who was an incredibly famous photographer, like her use of photography went far beyond that. And so it's nice for all of us to have these moments to see that. And Linda, I think there's so much to say about these images.
Absolutely, yeah. I'd like to lead in with the photographs themselves. What's really beautiful about these to me is that the emphasis on the ground is almost as important as on the shrubs or trees. You really see that contrast between the fairly stark, lowly vegetated soil and then these absolutely fabulous forms rising out of it, which partly tells you how tough this particular plant is as well. But that's often what you see in New Mexico is sort of a rolling, maybe gravelly, soil-based ground with very low, sparse vegetation, grasses and things, and then some amazing woody plant coming up out of that space, which says how efficient they are at finding water in the ground. This Artemisia tridentata is probably best known to people, at least in this area, because it has very, very fragrant, pungent leaves. And it was a plant that was extremely important to the indigenous people here and still is. And a lot of us make smudges out of it for spiritual reasons and also because it just smells so good when it burns. It's related to a plant that's used for a lot of incense bases as well. And the name is kind of fun, Artemisia tridentata. Artemisia, it has gray-green leaves, very silvery gray, which is made the light reflecting off minute hairs all over the leaves makes it look grayish or silverish. And one of the possible reasons for the genus name Artemisia might be that the goddess Artemis in Greek mythology was the goddess of the hunt and the moon, especially. And there's a sort of a nice visual in your mind, at least, between what the moonlight looks like and what these sort of glistening gray-green leaves look like. There's another possible Artemis who was Artemisia II of Caria in the Middle East. And she was a very strong woman. She was a queen. She was a naval commander, and she was a botanist way back in like 300 BC. And so she might be another reason this genus was named. And interesting that both of the possible namesakes are very strong women in their own right. The tridentata, which is the species name, is because the leaves are sort of three-toothed leaves. They're very small leaves. So.
That is great. I didn't know about the other Artemisia. I'm thrilled to learn that.
Thank you for sharing that, Linda. That's amazing. I think all the more reason for O'Keeffe to photograph the big sage.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so now we have a stump in Red Hills, and which is also part of the exhibition and shows that O'Keeffe was painting trees, yes, but also collecting desert driftwood and painting it in the landscape. And speaking of photography, And ironically, as the next slide, this painting really shows how O'Keeffe grabs a still life element and then magnifies it to almost a monumental scale, despite it being much smaller than the landscape behind it. And so it shows her play on scale and perspective and even color, because then you have the flame-hued mountains in the background. And she was known to go out of her way to be able to observe special color effects in the sky, whether it was at sundown, at sunrise, and that this becomes emblematic of that. But Bess and Linda, perhaps you can talk about stumps and their sculptural qualities, and this stump in particular.
I think we should start maybe with like, and this is the anecdote, the exhibition anecdote, that we had lots of conversation about this object, right? And so you see there's the painting from 1940, and then there's literally the object. So we should explain that a little bit more. That's why we have these two images. This piece of wood is still in our collection. And so she collected this piece of wood from out in the New Mexico landscape, brought it back to her home and kept it for her entire rest of her life. So from 1940 until she passed away, and it has continued to be in the museum's collection. So it was really, really thrilling to see that in person. And so hopefully when you all come into the exhibition, you'll see both of these pieces next to each other and in real life, but you'll get that little taste of it on your screen right now. But so the title of the piece is Stump in Red Hills. We had all sorts of discussion about what is and what isn't a stump, and which is sort of silly, but in a way it matters, because it's like, well, a stump still has roots. Is it still connected to the earth? This is not. It is a piece of juniper, and I loved it when we asked Linda how she would describe it. She said desert driftwood, and I think that is really poetic, but also really accurate, because, you know, I think I was struggling with this as somebody who's from New Mexico originally. In my mind, I was like, oh yeah, that's just driftwood, and then people were like, well, there's nothing for it to drift on, so it can't be driftwood. But I think that's really interesting, sort of in a funny anecdotal way, to think about
Yeah, the
how.
driftwood. Sorry,
Yeah.
the driftwood concept is when you first think of driftwood, you think something is washed up on a beach that's been battered and out in the salt water for a long time. But in New Mexico and other desert places, it's sort of a fun word to use to describe the wood that's either still standing wood or fallen from the tree, and it's been battered by primarily the sun. A lot of times you find this kind of wood in arroyos where it's been washed down the arroyo over time by water. And the wind certainly is part of the cause of the deep striations on the wood as well. So it really has very similar qualities to water washed driftwood. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's fabulous. And I think, Yadi, you were really right to talk about the colors in that as well, in that previous painting, and how I think, just like the one last thing I'll say about it is that I think folks, when they first see this painting, it feels really surreal or really abstract. Like, what is even this form? Is this like some sort of strange fire? And the colors that she uses are so powerful. But then you actually step out into the landscape in New Mexico at sunset, and those are the colors that you see. And so I think that's really so beautiful how she captures it in such like almost a hyper real way, but then it is also something that we can see not every day, but in the right moment, we can definitely see that stepping outside of our door.
Absolutely.
I also like, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just agreeing.
I was also struck by the painting, the wood, but also the painting even more so. And she has this ability to create these ambiguous plant forms that might also be human forms, or have some indication of that in the work. And this one, the first thing I saw when I looked at the painting was two lovers. embracing each other. Or it could be maybe a mother and child, either a mother holding a child or a mother with child. And so again, that quality of, she brought into her artwork that sense of the spirituality of trees and the human quality of trees and wood.
Yes, and I think I'm going to move over to the next slide so that our participants and our audience can sort of see the sort of sculptural qualities of branches and Linda, I know this is an image that you wanted to have on the slide, so maybe you can talk a little bit about it.
Yeah, I don't have to spend a long time on this, but this is a still living tree in our collection. It's in the Pinyon Juniper woodland. We didn't plant it. It's been there for a long time. It's an old tree, and you can see that sense of, is it a shrub or a tree? All these large stems or trunks coming from the same point on or near the ground. And I just love the sculptural quality of this tree, the deep furrows in the wood and the sort of shreddy quality of the bark, which you also saw in the big sage, the Artemisia. So I love that this is the way the trees grow, and I think the artist picked it up.
I think moving on to the keystone species that O'Keeffe painted in New Mexico and Linda, perhaps you can talk about what a keystone species is, and we can run through some of the paintings that really are the keystone species of New Mexico that O'Keeffe.
So there's three primary New Mexico keystone species, which are emphasized in the Rooted in Place exhibit. Pinon is a very, very important tree in our landscape here. It, along with junipers, grow in dry places. So, and they have very wide spreading roots. So they're very efficient at taking water up from the soil. They're keystone species in the sense that if they were removed from a landscape or an ecosystem, the ecosystem might not collapse, but it would change drastically. And in the case of the pinon, one of the important things it provides to all different living beings are the pinon nuts, or the seeds that are from the pine cones. And you can see in the detail insect picture there, this is recently taken. This particular pinon tree had been completely gone through by pinon jays and other birds, so all the pine cones are open and empty. But the pine nut is one of the most nutrient dense and nutritious plant foods there is in New Mexico and other places in the Pinyon Juniper woodland. So it's high fat and really healthy for a lot of different animals. The pinon tree itself is beautiful. A lot of people have strong connections to them, and they can be very sad when the pinon trees are stressed or die. It's a big emptiness in your heart as well as in the landscape when that happens. And I think the quality of the painting really picks that up. It feels sad, not just a dead tree, but as in the background, the sky that's sort of weeping, and the tree form itself is weeping.
Absolutely, quite a sad, derelict painting. For the sake of time, I'll move over to next slide. And another keystone species that O'Keeffe painted, the cottonwoods near Abiquiu. And Linda, you can go ahead and talk a little bit about the cottonwood.
Now, cottonwoods, as you can see from this absolutely gorgeous tree, color up late in the fall, and they bring us this amazing gold in the landscape when almost everything, as you can see from the grasses in this picture, has started to go dormant already. They're big trees, 50 to 60 feet, sometimes larger when they're near a rich water source. They do need water, so you only see them in the ecosystem in or near rivers or wetlands. This one's at a wetlands that the Botanical Garden used to manage. They just have such a quality of life to them. I've witnessed in this tree and one's near a young bear sleeping in the branches of the tree up high. I've seen eagles and owls perched on the tree. I've seen all kinds of birds and insects making a life on this tree. So again, it's one of the keystone species, limited to a specific environment, but very important in that environment. And full of life. I mean, there's a picnic table shown under that tree, and who wouldn't want to sit under that picnic table in that space? And this painting picks that up so well, even though you don't see the intensity of the gold, you see the movement. genus name for cottonwood is populus, which refers to the sound the trees make when the leaves move. It sounds like people chatting or murmuring in the background. And that whole sense of liveliness really is picked up in the painting.
Absolutely. And then maybe ending, I think, with the juniper, and this sort of arboreal portrait of what was a tree that has a relationship with the Irish author Gerald Heard, that O'Keeffe painted to the right. And Linda, you can talk about the juniper and why it's called a cedar tree in New Mexico.
Ah, yes, cedar tree. There is a species of cedar called red cedar and some other ones that grow generally east of the Mississippi, and there are some cedars that grow on the northwest coast and high up in the mountains. In New Mexico, we don't have that cedar. It's a more thirstier plant than this one. This is an extremely drought tolerant juniper, one seed juniper, because the juniper has cones, which are also called berries, the blue waxy cones, and they have one seed inside of them. They tend to look very shrubby, close to the ground, very dense trees, and they're often in woodlands with piñons, but they're slightly more, or quite a bit more drought tolerant, heat tolerant than the piñon are. So in a woodland, you might see over time more juniper remaining than piñon as climate change takes its toll with heat and drought. I love that the painting picks up this twisty quality of movement and also just the form itself. Junipers will often do that as a result of the environment they're in. Very windy environments will cause them to twist and turn, or going through periods of drought might do that to them as well. Again, it's a keystone species, very, very important in the environment.
Absolutely. And then we have a few images of Abiquiu and Ghost Ranch, and this one being sort of the Chama River and the cottonwoods that grow around it, and then a painting of the Chama River in the center. Linda and Bess, if you have anything to say to this.
I think, we know that we're running low on time. We want to give enough time for folks to ask questions. But I think, the Chama River, much like all of the other rivers in New Mexico, are really central, not just ecologically, but culturally. And so this is a central site for indigenous communities from time immemorial. Many Tewa communities were along the Chama River originally, still some are. Hispano communities have risen up, and farming and agriculture has happened along this river. So, and it's right along the view. So those were some of the cottonwoods that she was painting.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And then we have a few images of O'Keeffe's garden. One image from Maria Chabot of O'Keeffe in her garden. One really interesting question that I had while I was attending a tour of the home and studio in Abiquiu from a guest was, did O'Keeffe ever paint any of the trees in her garden? And the short answer is no. And which is particularly interesting that she did not paint that which she had within a few feet away from her, and with good view. So this is a layout really of the Abiquiu house and garden. And Beth, maybe you can talk a little bit about it.
Absolutely. I mean, I think this is a great image. So O'Keeffe really she was not full-time in New Mexico. She had actually gone back to New York. Stieglitz had passed away, and so she was working on settling his estate. And Maria Chabot, her friend and her helper, her assistant, and really who was the project manager, one would say now, for the rebuilding of the house in Abiquiu, was in correspondence with her back and forth on figuring out the plans and how to do this work. And so this is sort of the layout for the things that would be planted. And you can see tamarisk, cherry, mulberry, nectarine, which is sort of surprising. Not all of these survived. So I don't think there's still a nectarine tree up there. But pear, there's definitely old apricot is on there, which is great. Apple, peach, lots of mulberry. So some of them are better suited for life in northern New Mexico than others.
Agreed. So we also have a couple of images of Ghost Ranch to show really what O'Keeffe was looking at when she and what she was surrounding herself with as she was painting these keystone species of New Mexico and the flora, the plants of New Mexico. These are a couple of of images of her house at Ghost Ranch, and you can see Pedernal behind it in the image to the left. And then we actually have a painting of Pedernal that O'Keeffe created in 1948. And Linda, maybe you can talk a little bit about how you were observing this painting and realized that maybe this is not a cottonwood after all, but rather a chamisa.
Well, it got similar color, that startling gold color, especially in the fall here, is so wonderful. Chamisas are shrubs, another one of those keystone species in New Mexico. But they're typically multi-trunked and they bloom low to the ground. Cottonwoods are almost always single-trunked, and their color, their leaves are up high off branches. So it felt like the form of that painting was of a chamisa, but if she wanted to call it cottonwood, that's fine. And here you can see the contrast between the two of them, the low shrubby, gorgeous yellow chamisa in the fall, and then the cottonwood with its, you can't quite see the branching, but you can tell that it's higher up in the tree and not coming from low down.
Right. A few more images of Ghost Ranch and Pedernal behind it. And really, when O'Keeffe makes paintings of Pedernal Mountain, she really presents it from different angles depending on where she's standing at the moment that she's creating the piece. And that is evident in the variety of Pedernal paintings that she created. And here's another Pedernal painting, and you can see the cottonwoods, which bears some semblance to some of these images from Malcolm Barron. And to conclude the presentation with the repercussions of climate change in New Mexico and what the reality of the present day reality of these trees and keystone species that O'Keeffe would have painted, and she probably would have seen something similar, but something very different in today's time.
Right. These are taken in areas that are quite similar in landscape and proximity to water. From Abiquiu, you can see the beautiful mountain horizon on the left one, but down below you see dying piñons as a result of 20 plus years of drought here. The junipers in this neighborhood, which is near my house, are all still fairly healthy. Piñons are definitely going down because they're not as drought resistant over a long time. And then the photo on the right is just showing the sort of slow demise of some of the trees. You can see these are all evergreens, but not much green left in them. And probably in a few years, a lot of these will be gone as well. And here is one more slide showing some of the greater repercussions of drought and heat in our landscape. This is a fire, can't remember the name of it, but it's a few miles from where I live outside of Tesuque, and it just burned through a lot of forest quite quickly. And that's probably something we're going to see more of in New Mexico and around the country as time goes by. It's beautiful, but it's a little bit frightening to live very close to this. So.
And then as the last slide to draw the presentation to a full circle is again another stump and its sculptural qualities. And maybe we can open up the Q&A now before we run out of time. And Molly, if you want to mediate that.
Absolutely. And also just thank you to the three of you for such a terrific and insightful conversation. What a wonderful way to welcome the new exhibition. So speaking of that, Joan would like to know if there will be a catalog for the exhibition or any sort of publication or writings that we can expect to go along with the show.
There's not going to be a print catalog, but there is already a landing page for it on the O'Keeffe website. So you can get a little bit more information there, including a lot of wonderful information from the Santa Fe Botanical Gardens with full links out to their site and other resources.
Thank you. Some already things to read. Connie would like to know, Georgia is quoted as saying, "I wish people were all trees, and I think I could like them then." Does it seem to you or to the three of you, in her tree paintings, if she painted trees, that they might have had the personalities of close friends?
Yes,
Interesting.
in some ways,
I'd say yes and no.
Yes and no. One, for the sake of not anthropomorphizing the tree without O'Keeffe to attest to that, but yes, and that Gerald's tree, for example, sort of dedicated to the Irish author Gerald Heard, and the D.H. Lawrence tree dedicated to the author D.H. Lawrence. So there are people tied to these renderings of trees that she is creating. And I do think that that's a very unique quote from O'Keeffe.
Absolutely. Carla would like to know, did O'Keeffe walk to her painting locations, or did she drive to them? How far did she travel to paint trees, and how did she get there?
All of the above. I mean, she was a traveler and an adventurer all the way through her life. And so some of the trees that you saw were sort of from her view outside of her home. So the cottonwoods from near Abiquiu, many of those trees she could see from her home in the village of Abiquiu up above the river valley. Some of the dead pinon, Gerald's tree, those were within walking distance, probably. I mean, Gerald's tree most definitely, from Ghost Ranch. But then she also would drive out and take camping trips all across New Mexico, especially northern New Mexico, even further afield than that. And she also wound up being, she flew all over the world as she got older. And so she definitely planes, trains, automobiles and by foot. Sometimes even, I think on some of her camping trips, there were horses and mules involved. So you can think of a mode of transportation, and she did it.
That's so interesting and a wonderful thing to imagine one looking at these paintings. Joan has a question. What was the actual size of that piece of driftwood that featured in the painting that you showed earlier in the presentation?
We all looked at it in person, and while I don't think Bess or I took out our tape measure to measure it, it is about the size of a human torso.
It's about 2 feet
tall.
Yeah.
2.5 feet.
Yeah, 2.5 feet. Yeah.
That's so interesting to think of the actual scale. It does look so monumental in that painting.
It does.
Yeah.
We have a question for Linda. This asker would like to know, are there other trees in the Woodlands area besides pinyon and juniper in the New Mexico Botanical Gardens?
Good question. In the area that we set aside as part of our garden, that's the pinyon juniper woodland, there are pinyons and junipers. There are a few other species of trees that we didn't plant around in the nearby arroyo and other places, and most of them are introduced/invasive trees, such as Siberian elm, but mostly pinyons down in the arroyo.
Great. We're getting a lot of thank yous from audience members who've just enjoyed what you've had to say throughout the presentation. We have some folks who have either been at the Botanical Gardens recently or are going to be in the area soon, who will get to see some of these things in person. We do have a question also for Linda. Could you remind us what the scientific name of the juniper tree from the Gerald's tree painting is?
Well, it's probably a one-seed juniper native to New Mexico, which the one I talked about, and it's Juniperus monosperma. There are a few other related junipers that are very similar that grow in Utah and other places in the Southwest, but the one that's mostly here is Juniperus monosperma, which means one seed.
Thank you. I think that about wraps up our time. Again, just, wonderful comments in our Q&A. Just to thank you all for your time and for sharing your insight on this subject. Is there anything else that you'd like to add before we close?
I just want to give Linda an extra huge, and everybody, Linda
Me
and the
too.
entire staff at the Santa Fe Botanical Garden, a huge thanks for all of your hard work, for your incredible and valuable contributions to this project. It has meant so much to us.
Well, thank you for inviting us to participate. It's been really exciting on our end too.
And
Yeah.
if you have a chance to see the exhibition in person in Santa Fe, please listen to the audio tour. Linda's team did an amazing job of really talking more in depth about these keystone species in the paintings that O'Keeffe made. And Linda, we're so grateful to have you here and to join our discussion. It made it all the more interesting.
Great.
And you can listen to the audio tour anytime. You can listen to it at home. You do
True.
not have to be here. You can listen to it on your devices.
Perfect. Well, thank you all again. And just a reminder, this is being recorded. We will send a link with the recording out in a week or so. And we can also include the links to those resources so you can continue to learn about this subject in welcoming the new exhibition. So we hope to see you soon for that. And thank you very much again for being with us today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.